Welcome to The Evolution of Torah, a history of rabbinic literature, a JTS podcast introducing you to the first 1,000 years of rabbinic literature with Rabbi Schwartz. This is episode 2, the Mishnah, the earliest voices.
During the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tried to save some element of Judaism. He saw that the temple was going to be destroyed, and he came up with a plan to escape and see the Romans. The way that he did this was by pretending to be dead. He took a dead cat and laid it next to his bed, and the smell spread. The people around thought that he was dead. This allowed his 2 students to carry his body, which others thought was a corpse, to the city gate. When he arrived there, the guards said to the students, "Let us stab the body so that we can ensure that in fact he's dead." They said to him, "If we do that, then the Romans will say that we desecrate the bodies of our teachers." This allowed them to remove Yochanan ben Zakkai from the city, to leave him outside the city walls so that he could actually escape and make it to speak with the Roman general. He managed to make it inside his tent and encountered Vespasian, and even predict that Vespasian would become the emperor of Rome. This made Vespasian very favorable towards Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And when at that moment messengers arrived from Rome declaring that he was indeed the new emperor, he said to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, "What is it that you ask? What reward can I give you?" Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Give me Yavne and its sages." Yavne was a city along the coast of the land of Israel, between modern-day Tel Aviv and the city of Ashdod. And there he's supposed to have gathered all of the rabbinic survivors of the Roman revolt. This new center was supposed to have been the seat of the Sanhedrin, the great court that had existed before the destruction of the temple. And there he was able to reformulate and to gather all of those traditions that would have been lost after the destruction of the temple. Now, we don't know if this story is a historical fact. We don't know if this story has a mythic quality. We don't even know if there really was a Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. None of those things are ultimately important for us. What's important for us is this story tells us how the rabbis thought about themselves. Instead of seeing Yavne as perhaps some kind of displaced persons camp or as an organic gathering spot, they saw a calculated move on Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's part to gather all of the rabbis together, to collect all of those traditions, to gather testimonies about what the practice of Judaism had been before the destruction of the temple. And it's this activity that we know happened, this collection of traditions, that would eventually result in the creation of the Mishnah. And as I talked about last time, the idea that there needed to be some kind of prosthetic limb or some sort of replacement for the temple has its manifestation in the creation of the Mishnah. This text and the process of Torah study is actually what replaces the missing element that's created by the loss of the temple. The book we call the Mishnah is the earliest voice of rabbinic Judaism, the earliest statement. The meaning of the word Mishnah comes from the Hebrew root shin nun he, which means to repeat. The word shana, which some of you might know, comes from the exact same root. The idea is that each year repeats one after the other. The meaning of Mishnah is also repetition. The idea is that these traditions need to be repeated again and again in order to remember them. The Mishnah seems in its origins to have been a memorized document. And if you want to think about a culture of passing memorized traditions, much like the way we remember jokes and tell jokes one to another, that might be a helpful way of thinking about it. The rabbis who transmitted these early Mishnah traditions were called Tanaim, singular Tana, and they had this culture of passing along these teachings one to another in these kind of set formulated traditions that mirror the way that we have formulations that we use when we tell jokes. If you can think about jokes being organized by, for instance, how many X does it take to change a light bulb, or a minister, a priest, and a rabbi walk in a bar, we categorize jokes this way. In the same way, these traditions are categorized or were kept together by their linguistic qualities. At some point over the course of this period of time when they're collecting these traditions, gradually they began to be gathered together into categories that would be more than just linguistic. The Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva's role, the famous Rabbi Akiva, who we'll talk about more later, was in fact putting the wheat with the wheat, the barley with the barley, and the figs with the figs. He was grouping them by subject matter rather than merely by the linguistic features within the Mishnah. It's this grouping by subject matter that allowed the Mishnah to take its character as a book and to actually have the great influence that it had in the centuries to come. So I want to show you a piece of the Mishnah, a passage of the Mishnah, to show you the kind of thing that I'm talking about. We have two different terms, the Mishnah, which is a book, and a Mishnah, which is a passage. You might hear me use those terms. That's the difference between the two things. The passage I'm going to show you actually comes from the tractate, the section of the Mishnah that deals with Passover. It's a Mishnah that deals with the checking for leaven, the checking for chametz on the eve of Passover. It says that on the night of the 14th, one should check for leaven using the light of a lamp. You're using an open flame to check if in fact there's any chametz, any leaven that's left in the house. That little section, just those words, on the eve of the 14th, we check for leaven using the light of a lamp. That seems to have been at its earliest core, those kinds of simple statements, what Mishnah actually was. It's a way of recording a tradition that was actually a lived tradition in language that could be easily memorized and easily passed on from one person to another. This seems to be very old. How do we know it's old? Because the next line in that same passage in the Mishnah is an interpretation or an expansion upon that first part. So the Mishnah continues and says, why is it that they said 2 rows in a wine cellar? Because that's a place where people take leaven. The idea is that an individual, when they're eating a meal, they'll have their piece of bread in front of them, they'll run out of wine, and they'll go into the wine cellar, and they might accidentally end up leaving that piece of bread. Someone anonymous, at some point said that, in fact, you have to check the first 2 rows of the wine cellar. And that's an expansion upon that first part that just talks about checking the house using the candle. A third element we often have in a Mishnah would be attributions, attributed statements, explanations of anonymous statements. So in this Mishnah, there's a third part that talks about a dispute between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, these 2 old schools of thought. They are interpreting what it means to talk about the first 2 rows of the wine cellar. So Beit Shammai says it's the 2 rows that are on the entire face of the wine cellar. And Beit Hillel says, no, it's just the 2 upper outer rows, just those 2 rows at the top of the wine cellar. And we can see that this is an explanation. So we have these then 3 parts. Part 1, an ancient tradition that tells you have to check for leaven using a candle. Part 2 that says, yeah, in addition to the house, you have to actually check the wine cellar. And part 3, where we have this dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai about which parts of the wine cellar you have to check. This, in general, is going to be a pattern that we see repeating again and again in a Mishnah. And this is the way that the Mishnah, as it came to be over the course of time, was put together. The Mishnah that we have today is organized in 6 orders. The orders are the following. Zra'im means seeds. It's laws related to agriculture. Moed means a set time. It's laws relating to a festival. Nashim means women or wives, and it relates to family law. Nizikin means damages, and it relates to criminal or civil law. Kodeshim means holy things, and it relates to sacrifice. And Tohorot means pure things, and it relates to ritual purity and impurity. I'll talk a little bit more in the next section about how the Mishnah was put together. There is a book that we call the Mishnah. That book was put together by Rabbi Judah the Prince, who in Hebrew we call Rebbe. His period of activity was near the end of the 2nd century, near the beginning of the 3rd century, and he put together what we today think of as the canonical collection of Mishnayot, of Mishnahs, that we call the Mishnah, the book that we call the Mishnah. The Tosefta is something we should talk about also. It's a supplement to the Mishnah, and it has its origins in the early 3rd century. It's a layered text, and it contains material from both before and after the Mishnah was compiled. Some of the contents are passages of early Tannaitic texts that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi didn't include when he compiled the Mishnah. And then there are also later comments on the Mishnah by rabbis who lived after his compilation. So it's possible for the Tosefta to contain passages that respond to the Mishnah on one hand, and also passages that the Mishnah postdates and responds to. Now, because of all of this complexity and because of the difficulty of the texts, the study of the Tosefta is going to be restricted generally to really learned scholars of rabbinics. I mentioned before that there are 6 orders in this book. I mentioned that one of them deals with wives or women. I want to tell you a little bit about that order now. And also it gives me an opportunity to talk about the role of women in this early developing rabbinic movement. First of all, you should know that in fact there is a lack of direct women's voices in the Mishnah and in rabbinic Judaism in general. It's thought that there was an ongoing kind of oral Torah that was in fact passed from mother to daughter, but those things were ultimately not thought of by the larger Jewish society in the Middle Ages or at the beginning of the printing press as important to write down, and so many of those things were lost. We have indirect testimony of those types of things, but anytime that I talk about women now or later in this discussion, that we're talking about indirect testimonies. It's men talking about women. And I apologize for that, but that's all we basically have. So in the ancient world, you may know that there was male domination. There was patriarchy that existed. Male society seemed to have been the dominant kind of elite society. And women were more at the margins. Women were more under male control than they are today when we're sort of in a period of relative equality. That said, there are different kinds of patriarchy. There are different kinds of male domination. There's male domination that's actively hateful of women, and then there's male domination that is centered on men, but not actually actively hateful of women. It's very clear from the Mishnah that the rabbis in this time period, while they were not proponents of equality between men and women, they had a general principle of fairness. They might not have wanted things to be equal, but they did have the idea that human beings are human beings, and all human beings should, in fact, be treated fairly. Now, women are a constant presence as a subject of thought in the Mishnah, and it's clear that there's a kind of feudalistic understanding of the relationships between men and women. In other words, the husband is at the center, and there are concentric circles around where the wife is next in line, after that children, then slaves, which they did possess in this period, animals, and then finally movable property and land. Now, when I talk about that feudalistic relationship, you can see that relative to the other people in that set of concentric circles, women are closer to the center rather than further away, and so their status is relatively higher. The fascinating thing is that even though there is this inequality of ritual and family law in the Mishnah, when it comes to economic regulation in criminal law, women are completely equal as far as the Mishnah is concerned. So if a woman has a business and she gets into a dispute with another person, she can bring a suit in court in the exact same way that a man can, and there are lots of cases in the Talmud of women being victorious in lawsuits. The other piece that I want to talk about here is the question of who the rabbis saw themselves as in contradistinction to women. Now, the rabbis have a very strong God in their imagination of who God is. They also imagine sort of a God the Father, that God is in some ways gendered male. And since they see themselves as being God's spouse, they often see themselves as taking on this kind of feminized role. I talked in a previous episode about gentleness and nonviolence being sort of rabbinic masculinity. That's absolutely the case. And one of the things that we see happening in Tractate Nashim is a metaphor developing where they see marriage, rabbinic marriage, as being a metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel, and more specifically between God and the rabbis. So this metaphor for relationships, this metaphor in which God is kind of male-gendered and is in relationship, almost a kind of marital relationship with the rabbis, brings up for our generation the following question. Is there homoeroticism in rabbinic culture? And we'll discuss that next time when we discuss the Talmud, the next major statement of rabbinic Judaism.
Thanks for listening to The Evolution of Torah, a History of Rabbinic Literature from JTS with Professor Mordechai Schwartz. It was recorded here at JTS by Larry Camiola and produced by Rabbi Tim Bernard. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can find all of JTS's podcasts at www.jtsa.edu/podcasts, and you can send us an email at onlinelearning@jtsa.edu. Please support JTS podcasts and other community learning programs by visiting jtsa.edu/podcastgiving to donate.